So the way I like to define computer programming is, how do I tell this stupid piece of metal to do what I want? And that really sums it all up. You don't have to be a genius or know math to know how to code. It's just learning a totally artificial skill of how do I tell a piece of metal that takes everything very literally. How do I sort of trick it into doing something that I want? Computers, although they're not smart, they don't have any intelligence, they are really good at certain things. They're good at automating things. So if I could just trick it into automating something that I want automated, then I can leverage computers for myself. Now, at the root level, computers really only understand zeros and ones, known as binary. It's funny, I was at a wedding a few years ago, and I bumped into an old friend, and I told him I'm a computer programmer, and he's like, oh, so you just code in zeros and ones? I'm like, yeah, my keyboard only has 2 keys. And he wasn't sure whether to take me seriously. So at its base, the computer only understands zeros and ones, but what computer scientists have done over the past few decades is they've made it so that we don't have to type in zeros and ones. What they've done is invented this concept of computer languages that are something that resemble the spoken tongue a lot more than zeros and ones. And what they've done is made it that you could just type in a computer language, and then the computer is trained to break that down into the zeros and ones that it understands. So they've saved us. I mean, I guess there was a time where people just typed zeros and ones. I don't know exactly how it works. I wasn't around back then, but the concept of computer language is to make it so that we don't type in the zeros and ones, we type in a language that resembles English. Now, it's not English, otherwise it wouldn't be called code. But it's something that we can understand more easily. We type that in, and the computer is trained, someone else typed in a bunch of zeros and ones to train the computer how to break down this computer language down into the zeros and ones that it understands. Does that make sense? Now, you mentioned assembly. So assembly is a very low-level language that almost looks like zeros and ones. It's really hard to understand. That is a language that breaks down directly into zeros and ones, but even that is really hard to use because it really, even though it has some things that resemble English a little bit, it's still really hard to understand. But at first, that was like the first or one of the original computer languages. Over time, people were like, I had enough of this. I can't type in assembler. Let's make a computer language that resembles English even more. And that will break down into assembly. And then assembly breaks down into zeros and ones. And you mentioned C. So C is a language that is sort of a higher level language than assembly. It breaks down into assembly, which in turn breaks down into zeros and ones. But C is something that has a few English words in it. It's easier for the human programmer to read and write. And we have to just tear out our hair a little bit less. Now Ruby, if you probably detect a pattern of where I'm going, Ruby, the language that we're going to talk briefly about tonight, is a language that breaks down into C, which breaks down into assembly, which is one of these children's songs, that breaks down into binary. Now, the reason why Ruby was created, it was created by a person, a Japanese fellow, who, because his name is very long, and for Americans it's hard to pronounce, they just call him Mats. It's like a nickname for his last name, which is like Mats something, something, something. So he developed Ruby about, I think, 20 to 30 years ago. His goal in making Ruby was making a language that resembles English a lot more than C, or than a lot more than other computer languages out there. That was his goal. His goal was to make it that it should be easy for us programmers to read and write code. Because even C, I mean, you could probably speak from experience, is not the easiest language to work with. Obviously, people have done it for years, but Ruby makes it even easier. And what in theory, the outcome of this is that if programmers are working with a language like Ruby, which is easy to understand, that, in theory, can increase programmer productivity. Because if we have to spend less time trying to interpret the code and write the code, we could just write it more naturally because it resembles English more so. So that will make it that we can write code faster. And that was sort of the idea behind Ruby. so because every computer language sort of specializes in something, something special. So you may have heard a language called R. R specializes in statistics. Python is a general purpose language, very similar to Ruby. PHP is really designed for web. So every language has their own thing. Ruby, if you were to define what is the thing that Ruby was designed for, Ruby was designed to be easily understood by programmers and therefore increase programmer productivity. In fact, one of the interesting things is that Ruby is a relatively slow language in terms of how the computer processes it. So it's a trade-off. Now, I wouldn't call it slow. It's still a computer, and it still works fast. But it is slower than C. It is slower than Python. Python is slower than C, too. But Ruby is one of the slower languages out there. But like everything in tech, it's a trade-off. Do you want a program that runs really fast, but it's slower for the programmers to write it? Or, and maybe C would be your choice there, or do you want a language that programmers can write really fast, even if it runs really slowly? Not really slowly, but slower. If you're writing technology for, let's say, some algorithm, some code that makes financial trades based on split-second timing, then Ruby probably isn't the right language for you. You might want to use C because it runs really fast. But if you're creating a startup that you only have like 3 months of funding, and you just want to be able to see, you put it out on the web, see if people sign up, and if not, you just sort of move on. Then you want programmer productivity to run really fast. And even if the website isn't the fastest thing out there, it's not like there's a ton of users anyway at this point. So it's for this reason that Ruby is a very popular language in the startup world. Because a lot of startups use Ruby because it allows the programmers to hit the ground running, get something on it. It sounds sort of crazy, but I could personally, as a professional Ruby developer, I could build many relatively complete web apps in Ruby in just a day or two. Just like something that's usable. I mean, it depends how many features there are in it, obviously. But in a day or two, I could have something in Ruby on Rails up. So it's a very powerful tool in that way. If you reach a critical mass of where you need speed, and that could happen if you have millions, the more users you have on your website, the faster your website needs to be. At that point, you may want to switch. If you're gaining traction, Twitter, for example, was originally written in Ruby, and then they felt that they were getting too much traffic. We all know like the whale when it's, they actually rewrote their whole website in another language that was faster. But they first used Ruby just to see if it was even worth spending time on. Does that make sense? Sorry I'm talking so much, we haven't gotten to the code yet. But that's just sort of the background. Interestingly enough, no one used Ruby for like 10 years, even after its creation. It was created by this fellow in Japan, no one really knew about it. The way it took off is that, actually Chicago has a huge history in this. So there's a guy in Chicago named David Hansen, who's still here in Chicago. He's one of the co-founders of a company called Basecamp. Yes, they were originally 37 Signals, and now they're Basecamp. I was just trying to remember which one was the original and what they are now. Basecamp is productivity software. He decided that he is going to use Ruby in conjunction with the web. To do that, he created something called Rails. So Ruby is really the language. Rails is something called a web framework, which I'll talk about momentarily. He used Ruby together with his own creation called Rails to make it easy to build websites using Ruby. And he built his own company, Basecamp, using Ruby. And when other people saw how quickly they can use Ruby to make their own websites, people started getting on the Ruby bandwagon. So actually Rails was what helped Ruby take off in popularity. And that's here, and they're still here, Basecamp still here in Chicago. So Ruby was invented in Japan, Rails was invented here in Chicago. Probably just a few blocks from here. Now, we mentioned that Rails is a web framework. That's a fancy way of saying that it's a lot of Ruby code, thousands of lines of Ruby code that David Hansen wrote that is sort of like something you could just like, it is the basis for any web project. So, if you Ruby at the plain Ruby language is very simple. You type in things like 1 + 1 or 4 divided by 2. It's very simple expressions. If you said, okay, take that ability and make a website out of it, there's a huge jump. You have to write lots of Ruby code, of complex Ruby code to start that. Here at Rails, which is basically, hey everyone, I wrote thousands of lines of Ruby code that if you just basically copy and paste it into your project, you have like a bare bones website running. And now all you have to do to customize your website is add your own Ruby code on top of it, or in addition to it. Does that make sense? So a web framework. Rails is a web framework, and a web framework is just pre-written code that David Hansen wrote for us, and it makes it that we don't have to worry about the website part of it, or like the architecture of the website, the foundation of the website. That's just there. We copy and paste that code, and then we customize the website with our own Ruby code. Obviously, this is somewhat abstract until you start working with it in action. But does that make sense from a sort of high level? Any questions? I'm not a lecturer, so if anyone wants to jump in with questions anytime, just shout. You don't even have to raise your hand. If you want, you can argue with me too. Okay. So for those who want to follow along, are you more or less okay getting on Cloud 9? Again, you can still understand this presentation even if you just watch. You don't have to follow along. And I will say that it's probably going to happen as you're following along. Something might not work if you have a typo or something like that. I guess we'll sort of play it by ear how we want to handle that. We're a small group, so if something, just a quick thing, you want to say, hey, it's not working for me, I'm happy to come over and look. If for some reason I can't troubleshoot it right away, we'll just have to move on so it doesn't hold up the whole lesson. But I'd be happy after we're done to look at it as well. I'm not going anywhere. Okay, so let's start by setting up this Cloud 9 thing. Now, normally when any professional who works with Ruby on Rails, and similarly like in our bootcamp, we don't use Cloud 9. To work with Ruby on Rails, you have to install Ruby and Rails onto your computer. And because that's a complex, it's not easy to do, unfortunately, and also could take like a half hour. What Cloud 9 does for us, it's a free online service that allows us to work with Ruby on Rails through their website. So we don't have to worry about installing anything. But just letting you know that in real life, you wouldn't be using this. Now, the people on Cloud 9 would yell at me for saying that. Their whole point is like, no, everyone should switch to this instead of doing it on your computer. But in reality, no one does that. In fact, there was another service before Cloud 9 called Nitrous that we used to use for these meetups. And they went out of business, just like no one used it. Because people they just like to work with things on their own computer. They don't want to have to do everything on the cloud. So I expect that Cloud 9 will go out of business at some point as well, in which case we'll have to figure out how to run these meetups in the future. But while Cloud 9 still exists, we could take advantage of it. So do people see a screen that looks more or less like this? So if you want to follow along, click on this big box that says create a new workspace. What this workspace essentially is a computer on the cloud that you're logging into. And that computer already has Ruby on Rails installed on it. That's sort of the idea here. You can choose any name for your workspace name. Call it anything. I mean, you can call it anything, but you can call it whatever you want. It doesn't really matter. If you want to see multiple words, I suggest dashes. So I'm going to call this intro dash app. But again, you can call it anything. It should be already checked as public. Technically, other people can see it. I don't think there's anything too private going on here. But the next thing you do is when it says choose a template, do you see this option that says Ruby? Click on that. That's going to make it that this cloud computer you're logging into has Ruby on Rails installed on it. It gives you other choices. You mentioned Python, so Django is sort of the web framework for Python. So what Django is to Python, Rails is to Ruby. But anyway, we're going to use Ruby, and we're going to hit this button called Create Workspace. And when I tried this earlier today, it did take a little bit. I guess they also have to, I don't know what they do behind the scenes. It's pretty impressive, the fact that they can do this, so it's unfortunate that it's going to go out of business. I should have done this first, so I could continue talking. Yes, thank you for saving me with the question. Yes?
It says remember to run your code on port 8080.
Yes, that's fine. Yeah, that's not an error message.
Oh,
That's just, yeah. So we could already jump to the next part. So, I'm going to start just talking, so even if it takes you a few more seconds to see this, but this is sort of what you want to get to. Every web developer, at least people who work with Ruby on Rails, use 3 primary software tools to use Ruby on Rails to develop websites. The 3 tools are your web browser, right? That's where you view your website that you're making. That's critical just to see that it's working as intended. You also use it to Google things when you're stuck, which you'll be, I mean, things, that's sort of a shocking thing to people who are new to development. They don't realize how much even developers with like 20 years experience still rely on Google to answer their questions. So that itself, I probably could run a meetup just like teaching you how to Google when you're stuck in development. That's its own skill. So the 3 tools are, the first is the web browser. The second is your text editor. So think like Microsoft Word, except that you never use Microsoft Word for writing code because it, behind the scenes, puts in all these other characters that aren't good for code. Instead, you can use, I mean, in Windows, there's things like Notepad++, and there's fancier ones. There are things called IDEs, which are really glorified text editors that have tons of features in them. Ruby on Rails developers, for some reason, just tend to they don't use IDEs so much. Just, they could, but they don't. It's just this trendy thing, I don't know why. They use sort of these like very simple text editors. I use something called Sublime Text, which I have downloaded on the computer. Now, here, in this Cloud9 environment, this big area here, this is your text editor. And these are your folders and files. And, sorry, this is not a real file. I'm just going to click on something here. See, I'm going to click on this file called gemfile. And that opens up this file here. And I can type stuff in. Don't type stuff in. This will break everything. But it's like, you know, Microsoft Word. It's your text editor. So that's tool number 2. And tool number 3, and this is, so these 2 you're basically familiar with their concepts. Tool number 3 is this window here on the bottom, which is called the terminal. The terminal is sort of a hard thing to describe at first, but it's basically a way to talk to your computer directly. You can create files, you can delete files, all from the terminal. Now most of you, if you have to create or delete a file, let's say you want to delete a file. Usually if you're on Windows, you would go into the File Explorer, I think it's called. Haven't used Windows in a while. If you're on a Mac, you go into Finder, and you click on things and delete files and stuff like that. The terminal is you can delete files from there by typing in text, but you can do a lot more. So
it's very powerful and very dangerous.
It's very powerful and very dangerous. That's right. There's more you can do. There's more ways you can talk to your computer and do what you want using the terminal than you can normally do with other programs on your computer. So, as we had I guess it's funny now. It wasn't funny at the time, but in one of the classes that we taught, so during the first year of our existence, I was the lead instructor here in Chicago. So one of the classes that I taught, it was like one of the first days of class, and I was teaching some terminal stuff, and one of my students accidentally deleted his whole computer. So it's very powerful. Actually, he didn't do it. It was the person next to him was trying to help him, and yeah, he tried to hold it. He held it together. It was good. Thankfully, it was a new computer he got just for class, so he didn't like lose all his photos or anything. But it was certainly frustrating. So yes, it is powerful and dangerous, and because we can do certain things with it that there's no other way to do, it becomes important. We'll see. You'll see soon why we'll use the terminal. Just I know it's sort of vague until you actually see it.
I will show the way how to destroy basically a computer to use. There's something called dev not zero, so it basically overrides every single file.
Yeah, I'm not going to show you how to do it.
Yeah, that's very dangerous.
Yeah, I don't know if anyone has actually done this, but I've heard that it's like a common like developer prank. That when there's like a new developer or someone's just learning to code, you're like, yeah, I have a cool trick you can run in your terminal. It will free up so much disk space on your computer. Just type in these things, this gobbledygook. And yes, it does free up space on your computer because there's nothing left. Yeah, so I don't want to be accused of making you dangerous. I'm not going to show you how to do that. So we, what's that?
Like, that's another benefit of using Cloud9, because if you screw up, you can basically start a new one instead of.
Yeah, so I can delete this cloud computer, everything on it, but then start a new one. Absolutely. Cool. So we have our 3 tools. We have our browser, because we're using all of Cloud9 within our browser. We have our text editor here. On the side, this is the folders and files, and we'll talk more about these in a moment. But if you click on any of these files, we can pull it up in the text editor here and edit the files. And then finally, on the bottom here, we have our terminal. And we'll see how to use that in a moment. Cool? Let's play around with Ruby a little bit. So since, like I mentioned, we have Ruby already installed on this cloud computer, we're not going to get into Rails yet. We'll do that in a few minutes. But if you type in IRB into your terminal, so this is, for some of you, this might be your first time using the terminal, you'll see that gobbledygook. Can you see? Can everyone see from where you're at? Because I could probably make it bigger. Or not. Or not. Okay. But if you can see, we're good. What IRB is a way that you can type in one line of Ruby at a time and get it to execute. So if I type in 1 + 1, which is valid Ruby, I get back 2. This is very, very simple. I could do 5 - 2 and get back 3. If I got back anything else, I would just ditch Ruby and start using another language. To do multiplication, use the asterisk. So 5 * 4 is 5 times 4. And I get 20. To do divide, you use /. So 100 divided by 10 is 10. So in a sense, you already know some Ruby before you even came in here. You shouldn't take this for granted. There's other languages. There's a language out there called Clojure that if you wanted to do 1 + 1, this is what it looks like. It's all up to the designers of everything about computer science is man-made. It's not natural. It's artificial. So just like we take it for granted that we could say 1 + 1, but if I want to design a language that's how you say 1 + 1, I can make it like that. Yeah, I've never used Clojure. Just seeing that sort of made it that I decided in my head I never want to use Clojure, but I assume that you get used to that kind of thing if you actually work with it professionally. If you want to get a random number between, let's say, 0 and 100, you type in rand, parentheses, and the number up to which you want to randomize. So I got back 93. You'll probably all get back a different number. That's between 0 and 100. But you could put any number in the parentheses, and then we'll pick a random number between 0 and that number. Any questions about that? If I want to know the current time, I can do time.now, but the T has to be capitalized. Now, this is actually the current time, not here. It is June 14th, but it's not 11:36 p.m. This might be the time zone of this computer, or the computer is set to have that time zone. But one thing...
It's universal time?
Yeah, or it's universal time. It is universal
like
time.
London time.
Yeah, it's universal time. Now this, if nothing else here, we talked about how Ruby is supposed to resemble English. You have to, if this is your first time using any computer language, you may not appreciate this, but time.now is pretty understandable. in most other languages, to get the current time would be something much harder to understand. So that's that's a good example of one of like the beautiful things about Ruby. Now, is rand 100 a beautiful expression? I don't know. It's not crazy. It sort of has rand in there, which is like randomize. Time that now is a much better example. Just another example. I'm not going to run it here because it would take. If I want to run a piece of code 5 times, so in Ruby, it's 5 times do, and then I'd put code after that. That would run 5 times in a row. In like Java, it would be, or JavaScript, it would be like for I equals 0, semicolon, I less than 4, I plus plus that. And then I'd put code in there and run 5 times. So just to contrast, like English-looking syntax versus other syntax. Now, once you work with JavaScript for a long time, you get to read that pretty quickly. But the idea behind Ruby is like, hey, if from the outset it resembles English, it's just a more pleasant language to work with, and there will be increased productivity. That's the idea. But that doesn't, this code doesn't work in Ruby that I just wrote. Okay, any questions about that? Okay, we're about to start getting into Rails itself and using Ruby and Rails together to build websites. But before that, we just need to describe very briefly about just how the internet works on a very high level. And I do have slides here, but I didn't create them, so I might, in the middle, decide to not use the slides. I did look them over before. So here we go. How do I play this thing? Does anyone know? Present. Okay. When I type in my browser, let's say facebook.com or www.example.com/stuff, right? That's called the URL. Familiar with that? I type it on the top of the browser. When you do that from your computer or your phone or your tablet, it goes into the internet, and I'm not going to describe how this part works, but eventually it finds a server somewhere in the world, a physical server, that knows to respond to this particular URL. Every URL is sort of like the home address, just like 123 Main Street is the physical address for a building. So too, a URL is essentially an address for some server out there in the world. Now, server is sort of a scary concept to people. It's like, oh, this black box, and you see pictures of rooms of servers and servers. All a server is a computer. It just typically doesn't have a monitor. It's just the raw computer, but it has code on it. So when I go into my browser and say example.com/stuff, it knows how to find the appropriate server out there in the world on Earth that knows how to respond to that. And then the server sends back to the browser a bunch of HTML code. The browser then takes that HTML code and turns it into a web page that is easily viewed by a human. So the browser knows how to take HTML and make it nice. All the server sends it, though, is just raw code, raw HTML code. Sends it back over the internet. Browser says, oh, I understand this stuff. That means you want this here and that there, et cetera, et cetera. And I've oversimplified it. The server really sends back more than HTML, sends back CSS, sends back JavaScript, but it sends back stuff that the browser understands and knows how to turn into a web page that is actually viewable and clickable by a human. Yeah?
I guess just to kind of highlight the concept here, so if you're doing web page development, you're using the HTML language. What you're actually doing is you're creating the HTML language that particular server that you're sending the HTML code from. Whenever someone types in the URL to your website
That's right.
that's designed using that language, all they're doing is they're pulling from their browser that HTML code that you wrote and then translating it via their browser into a page that's viewable by them.
That's exactly right. So when web developers write code, they're writing HTML code that is going to live on the server. And the server just waits for people to ask it for information by sending the URL to it. And the server says, okay, here's your HTML that some developer wrote. Browser, you know what to do with that stuff. I have no idea. I'm just sending you code. And we're going to do this today. We're going to actually write HTML code that is going to live on a server. Okay. Let's break this down a little further. So I don't know why I switched the example mid-slide. Probably because different people have their hands in this different slides. But now we're going to Wikipedia. So if I'm using this URL to go to a specific page in Wikipedia, which I don't even know if this exists, the browser takes that URL and actually breaks it down into smaller parts, which we're going to analyze here. You've heard of HTTP, right? Because you've seen it here. HTTP is yet another computer language. It's the language that browsers and servers use to talk to each other. So we're talking about a lot of different languages here, right? You talk Ruby, Rails, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, we mentioned those, and now I just threw HTTP at you. HTTP is a very simple language. It only has like a few words in it. It's it's a very small vocabulary. But that's the language browsers and servers use to talk to each other. So let's dig it. So this language here is HTTP. When you type in your browser this URL, the browser says, okay, I'm going to talk HTTP to the server, and I'm going to say this HTTP stuff and send that to the server. Let's break it down further. Sorry. Do you have behind you was it just dimming the lights a little bit?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, you could turn both of them down. I'll make it a little easier to see. So either way is fine. Yeah, that's good. If everyone's okay with that. So there's 2 lines here of HTTP. We're going to break it down in the first line into 3 sections. This is pretty clearly delineated here in the slide. So let's just back up for a second. We have en.wikipedia.org is called the domain. All the stuff that follows it is the more detailed URL. So in HTTP, they take the domain and make it the second line, preceded by this HTTP thing called host. It then takes the URL and puts it on the first line of HTTP. Over here, as part of making any HTTP request to the server, the browser declares, just so you know, server, I'm speaking HTTP language, and I'm using version 1.1 of HTTP. The browser does this all for you. You never have to do it. The browser does it under the hood. And over here, there's this thing called get. Now, this is known as an HTTP verb. There's about 10 or so verbs that HTTP can use. Anytime that you type anything into the URL in a browser and hit enter, the HTTP verb that is always used is get. This is all abstract until you see the contrast. But just to give you a little of that contrast, you know how you fill out a form? Like, hey, contact us to find more information. Give us your email, phone number. There's like a form on the web page. When you submit that form, that also sends a web request to some server somewhere. But very often, that uses the HTTP verb called post. These are all arbitrary things. Whoever invented HTTP said, I hereby say there's going to be 10 verbs, and you can use these verbs as you wish. And browsers decided, or whoever created browsers decided that, hey, whenever we send a URL the normal way by typing in a URL on a browser, hitting enter, that's always going to use the get verb in conjunction with that web request. When we do forms, that's typically going to send the post request using the post verb. It's all pretty arbitrary and abstract. The only reason you'll have to understand this deal with the verb is because we were going to deal with it briefly when we deal with Rails. So just hold this thing about the HTTP verb in your head. But until it's sort of this arbitrary thing. But the takeaway is that this is what happens when you type a URL in your browser and hit enter. The browser breaks it down and takes the HTTP language and formulates the request in HTTP. It takes your domain, it takes your URL, mentions the version, and says, hey, as part of this request, I'm using this HTTP verb called get, because that's what browsers do every time you hit URL. You enter URL and hit enter. Okay? Now, so this is the request. This is called the web request, meaning the browser is requesting information from the server. When the server receives the request, it then responds, also talking HTTP. Again, that's the language that browsers and servers use to communicate with each other. And this here is the HTTP response. What you see here, this is what the server sends back to the browser. Now, let's start with the body. The body is what you see. Oh, that's annoying. The body is here. This is HTML. Some of you may recognize that if you've ever seen HTML before. This is the main thing that the server sends back to the browser. However, it does send all this other HTTP gobbledygook that you never end up seeing on your web page, but your browser takes it and may or may not utilize that information for its own needs. You could also sort of see here, it says, hey, I'm also speaking HTTP 1.1. We're speaking the same language. The one interesting thing to point out here is this 200. Every time a server sends a response back to the browser, it always includes some sort of status code, which is always a 3-digit number. And again, these are arbitrary numbers that someone somewhere decided represents different things. 200 is the number that represents, okay, everything's good. I understand your request, and here's your response. Is anyone familiar with any other status codes? 404. So you may have heard of 404, right? Page not found. What that is, the reason it's 404, that happens to be the status code. If the server says, hey, I know you're talking to me because you mentioned my domain, but the URL, all the specific things you put after the domain in the URL, I'm not programmed to recognize that particular page. And therefore, it responds with a 404 status code in its response. And it will not contain a body because it says, actually it might contain like a body that's like a page that, just the template of every time you get a 404.
So the 404 error, that arises not so much from the server itself that's sending the information, it's arising from your browser failing to translate the information.
No, the server's actually saying in its response, 404. Right. And the browser's like, okay.
Like every single code that starts in 400 is an error, right?
Yeah, so there's about, I'm going to guesstimate like 50 or so status codes. If you just Google HTTP status codes, you'll see the chart, like on Wikipedia, of like all the different possible 3-digit numbers you can get and what they represent. There's a funny one. I forget which one it is, because programmers are weird and have a quirky sense of humor. There's one response that represents, I am a teacup. You never actually get it in real life. Like a server will never actually give you, but in the people who made up all the status codes, they're like, let's throw in a funny one. So it's very arbitrary. You can Google that. You'll see it. If you Google status codes, and I would do it now, but we're running out of time. So, okay. So, okay. Now we're going to talk about Rails specifically, and I'm debating how exactly I want to. Everything I'm about to describe here on this slide is not going to make perfect sense until we actually see it in action. So just keep the vague thoughts in your head, sort of abstract. You're all going to look at that. Before we look at that, when we write Ruby on Rails, this is the key concept here, we are writing the server code. We're writing the code that lives on the server. So how does the server know that when you type in, let's say we're writing Facebook, right? Our server is facebook.com. How does our server know which HTML to respond with when you say facebook.com/home, if that's the URL, or facebook.com/posts, or all the various URLs that are available on the facebook.com website? How does the server know which HTML to respond with in those various URLs? That's the code that we're writing. That's Ruby on Rails. Ruby on Rails is essentially that code that says, if the URL that we receive as part of the web request is /ABC, then let's give back this HTML and a status code of 200. If we get this other URL /def, then let's send back this other HTML and a status code of 200. If we get any other URL that we don't have on our list, we're going to send back 404. We're the ones writing all that code. We're writing the code for the server when we do Ruby on Rails. Does that make sense? Sort of abstract. Okay, so now we're going to dive a little bit into the details of Rails, and we're going to sort of analyze the life cycle of a web request and a web response. Again, this won't make perfect sense until we do it in action. And even then, it still might not make sense, but we'll try. This Chrome icon is sort of representing our browser. When we type in, oh man, I chose another domain. Okay, let's say we're writing code for your-rails-app.com. We're web developers hired by that company. It's probably going to go out of business in a month. And we want to write Rails code, Ruby on Rails code, for what happens if our server receives a request with /home as the URL. What are we going to respond with? So we know generally that our server is going to respond with some HTML. And the browser is going to take that and turn it into a page that a human can enjoy. Or not enjoy. Hopefully enjoy. But now we're going to go deeper into the way it works in Rails and how the different components of Rails that actually help decide which HTML to respond with. So there's a type of component. These are the names of various components within Rails. It's called routes controller view. Again, I'm just going to keep it very abstract right now. The routes there's a file in our Rails code base that has the list of all the web requests that we know about, that we're ready to receive. So in Wikipedia, there's some, right? I mean, you can imagine how many URLs there are out there that it could receive. But if we're working for a very small website, we might just have 3 URLs, sort of like the home page, the About Us page, and maybe the Contact Us page, right? So we're going to program our website to only respond to 3 types of web requests, 3 types of URLs. And then we can say, anything that doesn't match this list, we're going to just send you back a 404. That is what the routes is. It's that list of all the web requests that we're saying that our server knows about. Okay, and we'll see that in action. That leads to something called a controller, which is basically, again, this is the vaguest part, apologize. We'll see it in action in a second. But once the server says, let's say we send a web request, and it is one of those 3 URLs in our routes file. And we recognize it. We're like, oh, this is one of the ones we know about. The next thing that happens is in our routes file, it's sort of like a sign that says, go here next and run this code. If we receive the URL /abc, go here in this thing called the controller and run the code, whatever code we put in there. And then finally, so in the controller, we basically say, hey, send this HTML file back. And the view is the actual HTML file that we write that the server will send back. Okay, you'll see it in action. It's just like, at some point it gets to the point of where it's like, I'm describing how to play a musical instrument. Let me just play the instrument and show you. Yes?
So if I'm understanding this correctly, then the routes is simply the composite listing of all possible commands that could be requested.
That's right.
From the server. And the controller itself is the one that matches from the list of requests, the one that's actually requested, and then view is simply
the HTML. Yeah, again, this will be even more concretized when we see this in action. Yeah?
Is this similar to MVC?
Yeah, so you may have heard of MVC. The V, so let me just go back to that slide for a second. So Rails is called an MVC, this is sort of an aside but to answer your question. Rails is called an MVC framework, which the V represents view, the C represents controller, and the M represents something I don't have here. It's called models.
Okay.
And if you came back for like a future, more advanced meetup, I could teach you about models. But in what we're doing today, you don't even need models, so we're just going to do the VC part of MVC. if it was up to me, I would call it like an RMVC framework to include routes. But okay, no one else does that. So, okay, let's talk about this set of folders and files here on the left-hand side. When we told Cloud9 that we want to set up a Ruby on Rails computer, it automatically gave us all these folders and files. This is our code. So remember how I told you Rails is a lot of pre-written code that we start with and then we add our own to customize it? This is not all, but this is a lot of that pre-written code. So we don't have to start with an empty project. We start with folders, and if you look in each side of these folders, a lot of them have subfolders, which have subfolders, and there's just a lot of pre-written code. And what we do is we add code to appropriate spots to customize our website.
Does Ruby on Rails use CGI for web?
CGI? I don't believe so.
I believe like a lot of web frameworks do is that it makes like all the interaction with the CGI, which is kind of like the bare bones web framework.
I don't.
And then basically like frameworks like Ruby on Rails, well, frameworks like Django,
Yeah.
they use abstract a layer.
Yeah, I honestly don't know how Rails works that well under the hood. That's one of the nice things about Rails is that you don't have to. You just know how to learn how to use Rails. You don't necessarily have to know how it works under the hood. Sometimes there's an advantage to learn how, but it's huge. I mean, it's thousands and thousands. I mean, I mentioned that David Hansen started it, but since he started it, thousands of programmers have also added onto it. So it's a massive project. So even if no one knows, even David Hansen by now doesn't know how it all works under the hood. There's just too much. Okay, we're definitely not going to go into all these folders and files and what they do. We're just going to touch some of them, the ones that we need to build something very basic. Okay. You don't have to do this. I'm going to hit Command or Control L. That just clears up, that just refreshes that terminal. You don't have to do that. I'm just doing it for clarity of presentation. So remember that we have the routes controller view. So the routes, we're going to look at the routes file first. The way to find that is that open up this folder here called config. It lives in there. How do I know it lives in there? Because I learned how to use Rails. Basically, something you learn when you learn a framework like this is, where does Rails keep everything? You don't know everything by magic. It's arbitrary. Who made up Rails decided we're putting the routes file in this folder called config. Do you see this file called routes.rb? So you can open it up, click on that. You'll see something like this. RB, by the way, stands for Ruby. All Ruby files typically end with the .rb file extension. Now, there's a lot of stuff in here already. And it's just a lot of, it's mostly comments, which aren't real code. It's just helpful information. I'm going to delete all these comments, but be careful. Don't delete the top or bottom line. See the top line, Rails.application do, and the final line is end. You actually need that. Everything else, though, in the middle, you don't have to get rid of this. I'm going to get rid of this for clarity of presentation. But you should end up with that. Everything in between is going to be our list of routes, the list of URLs of web requests that our Rails app will understand. Let me just show you an example. And this is where the concept of the HTTP verb comes in. So let's say we're creating a website that has multiple pages. And we're going to have a website that has an About Me page. Okay? And we're going to make it that the URL that you need to access the About Me page is going to be /about_me. Why? Because that's what I made up. That's how I'm the programmer. I get to decide these things. So I'm going to say get, and then put in quotes, /about_me. Now, I'm not done with this line yet. But this, remember how we talked about every time that you type a URL into the browser and hit enter, the way the browser sends the web request is it always uses the HTTP verb get. That's why we're saying get over here, to say that one of the web requests that our server should understand is the web request that consists of the combination of the get HTTP verb and the about me URL. So this is officially on our whitelist. This is something that our server should respond to and not give a 404.
Is get a regular function in Ruby, or is it some sort
No, this is specific to the Rails routes file.
Yeah, I was just wondering because on Ruby parentheses are optional, so I was wondering if you can just.
Yeah, under the hood it's using methods, but all this stuff that we're doing now is much more Rails than it is Ruby. There's
So
some.
will it work with parentheses, or it has to be that way?
I've not, convention is to do it without parentheses. Maybe it would work with parentheses. I never tried it, but no one ever does that. Then we put this weird arrow called a hash rocket, which consists of an equal sign plus a not plus, equals and a greater than sign. And this, we're about to say that if we do receive this request, if our server receives a request from a browser that consists of the combination of the verb get and the URL about me, then we're gonna send them, the next thing we trigger, I should say, is this particular controller. So we're going to put, also in quotes, the name of our controller. Now we didn't create this controller yet, but we will. I'm going to call it the Pages controller. Now I'm still not done yet, but what I'm saying so far is that, hey, if we get this web request, the next piece of code that we're going to trigger is going to be found inside the Pages controller. Now the Pages controller is actually can be divided into multiple parts called actions. Again, these are all made-up terms. We have to, in addition to specifying which controller we're triggering, we have to also specify which action within that controller we're triggering. And I'm going to make up an action name called about. Again, this part is also still abstract until we see the controller. But what this means in English is that if our server receives this web request that consists of the verb get and the URL about me, we are now going to trigger code that is found elsewhere in our code base, and where specifically it's going to be found inside the about action that can be found in turn within the controller called the Pages controller.
What's in between though?
Sorry, that's a pound sign. Now this is very, very specific, like it needs to be a pound sign. You need to have quotation marks before and after. If any single character here is off or uppercase, then it shouldn't be. I mean, it won't work. So it's very, programming is very demanding in that way. The good news is that you usually get an error that shows you exactly where the problem is. Okay, the next step is let's write the code for the controller. Now, the controller, although it sounds like some physical mechanism, is just another file in our code base. Okay? Now, it actually doesn't exist yet. We have to create it. And this is going to be, I think, maybe the only time that we're using the terminal tonight. I might stand corrected, but the easiest way to create the controller, we could create the controller by making a new file in our text editor, but it's actually easier to run a command from our terminal. And the command, again, a very specific command that comes with Rails, is Rails generate controller pages. And basically this is saying, hey Rails, I want to create a new controller file, and I'm going to name this controller the Pages controller. I can name it whatever I want. It's an arbitrary name, but conventionally it's plural. I could call it the Purple Hippos controller if I so wanted. But just to make a sort of more normal name, I'm choosing the Pages controller. And then I hit enter. You could try a different name for your controller, but if you want to follow along more easily, I suggest you do what I do. Then you see all these other gobbledygook running in your terminal, which basically means it successfully created the controller in your code base. It also created a bunch of other files in your code base too. But we're just going to look at the controller. Now, where do we find this file? Again, this is all based on the convention of Rails, and I will just show you where to find it. So if you look, one of the top folders you should see is called app. Does everyone see app in your code base? For me, it's the topmost folder within the project. For the record, app is like the main folder in your Rails project. Most of the coding you'll ever do in Rails is within app. Although the routes file is in config, mostly everything else is in app. Inside app has a bunch of subfolders. You could probably guess where the controller might be found in the controllers subfolder. And see this file here called pages_controller.rb? That did not exist when we first logged in here. That file was created because we ran this command in our terminal, Rails generate controller pages. Now if we open up that file, it only has 2 lines of code in it. I guess it's not that much easier. We probably for the same price could have just created this file and wrote those 2 lines of code. This is our controller. Now I mentioned that the controller is broken up into several actions. These are all just arbitrary terms. An action looks like this. So let me just create a bunch of actions. Here we have 3 actions. One is called A, one is called B, one is called C. Those are actions. I could put code, any arbitrary Ruby code that I want within each of these actions. Now if we look at our routes file again, we said that if our server receives this web request of get about me, then the code we want to trigger is going to be inside an action called about within our pages controller. So to that end, we have to create such an action. So I'm going to create an action here on top called about. Because I don't need these other actions, I'm going to delete them. That was just for example. I now have an about action within my pages controller. And I can put any code I want here. I could put any Ruby code, I should say, 1+1. So if someone right now goes to my website and types in the URL, my domain / about me, that line 1+1 is going to get triggered. And it's going to say 2. Now nothing's going to happen with that 2. It's just an example. But that will run. And Ruby will say, hey, that's 2. And then do nothing with it. Now what we are going to do with this is say, okay, let's send back some HTML for the browser to understand that it can display an About Me page. Because that's really what we want to do here. Right? We want to make it that when the user goes to our website and types in our domain /about me, they want to see an About Me page. So really what we want to do in this controller is say, hey, send back this particular HTML. Now what we do here is instead of writing the HTML right here in the controller, we just say render and then the file name which will contain the HTML in it. And I will call it about.html because that seems like an appropriate file name. This file doesn't actually exist yet. We're about to create it. But this line says, find the HTML file called about.html and send it back to the browser. Our next step is that we will have to create this HTML file. Does that make sense? Okay. Again, this will be most clear when we see the whole thing. So let's create that about.html file. Now Rails, everything about Rails is like there's a place for everything. You can't just decide where you want to put different files. Everything belongs in a certain place. So the place where you put your HTML files are within app within the subfolder here called views. It's a sister folder to controllers. And you see how views has 2 subfolders within it, layouts and pages? because we're dealing with the pages controller, we need to put our HTML file within the pages folder. Currently, the pages folder is empty, but we're going to change that right now. I'm going to right click on it and say new file. And I'm going to call it about.html. But it has to be in that pages subfolder of the views subfolder of the app subfolder. Otherwise, Rails will not find it. At first glance, it could be annoying, like, oh, I have to put it in this exact place. But the beauty of it is that if you become a programmer on another person's project, you know exactly where to find everything. If we didn't have this convention, you'd be like, I don't know where this about the but now you know where to find it. Oh, I know. Yeah, so this is something called convention over configuration. Configuration means you could set it up however you want. Rails takes the approach of, no, let's follow a specific convention. All Rails programmers have to do everything the same way. There's advantages and disadvantages, but the advantage of that is that it's easy for you to find anything on another person's project. Forget another person's project, on the project you worked on a year ago and you don't remember anything about. Yeah.
How did you get the HTML on the side thing? How did that show up?
This file,
Yeah.
I right-clicked and I said new file.
Oh, okay.
And then I just typed in about.html. Now if I double click on that file, it's empty, right? I just created it. This is where I could put HTML. Now, we give other meetups where we teach about how to do HTML, but HTML is yet its own language. H1 is a header, sort of like a headline. We're going to say, this is my About Me page. And then we're going to do a paragraph. And say this is a paragraph, and you can type in whatever else you want here. Paragraph. And we're very excited, so we have some exclamation marks in there. If you know more HTML, go crazy. Okay, now we're going to test this out. To do so, within Cloud 9, it's actually a little different in real life, but we're in Cloud 9. So you see this thing called Run Project? Click on it. Okay. This stuff is happening. At some point, you should see this on the side. It says your code is running at this domain. Might take a second. Do you see that? Click on it. That's going to open up a new tab in your browser that's going to have your website. And you're like, this isn't my website. Well, that's because we didn't go to the right URL, right? What URL do we have? About_me, right? So let's add, this is my domain. This is like facebook.com. But I didn't specify which URL within facebook.com I want to go to. So to do so, we add / about_me. And that is my web page. If it didn't work for you, I could troubleshoot it after. So it working for some of you? So just to take a step back for 1 second, is it clear Rails is the code for your server that runs your website? It says, the server says, I'm ready to accept the URL, and I'm ready to respond with the appropriate HTML if I recognize that URL. If I don't recognize the URL, I'll respond with a 404. What happens if I type in some URL it doesn't recognize?
404.
This is, you see this, but this is a 404. Now, why didn't that happen when I was at the home page? That's because of a default thing about Rails that it says, hey, if you go to the home page and we don't have any code in the routes file for that, it just gives you this default page. But let's fix that. Let's make a a page for the home page, right? Every web page at least has that, right? Before I do so, we obviously covered a lot so far. So questions. Actually, before questions, let me just review again what we did on a high level. We basically have these three components: routes, controller, view. So we're going to start here at the controller again. This says, hey, if we, the server, receive this web request, this combination of the about_me URL and the get HTTP verb, then we're going to trigger the code that is found within the about action that lives within the pages controller. So moving along, we're looking at the pages controller. We find the about action, and the code within that action runs. There happens, in this example, just to be a single line of code. That code says, hey, find the about.html file and render, which is the Rails way of saying, send that back to the browser, along with the 200 status code. And finally, our third file is the actual view file. This is the actual HTML that the server sends back. Our browser then interprets that and displays it as such.
Does Ruby only work with HTML in order to do web design, or you're just using that as like a catch-all?
No, so HTML, all websites use HTML.
So, okay, so you have to learn Ruby and HTML.
Yes, and in fact, in our bootcamp, for example, you learn Ruby and HTML and CSS and JavaScript and SQL. They're all used together to create a website. The good news is that HTML and CSS are each very, very simple. In fact, in our bootcamp, we spent, I think, less than a day on the combination of them. So it's not like you have to learn a ton. I mean, you can sort of get the sense that, or not. Just trust me, HTML is very simple. But yeah, you could put other HTML here if you know how to make tables and whatnot, and you could put anything else there and have your own web page. Going back, let's go back to our routes file, and I'm going to make another web request that we'll accept. This time, I'm going to do get, and in quotes, just a /. That is the home page. Basically saying that if I receive a request that is just the get and really no URL, which really is the home page, then let's trigger the code that lives within the home action within the pages controller. Now the home action doesn't exist in the controller yet, we didn't write it, but we will in a moment. Does that make sense? So I'm going to jump to the pages controller, and we're going to make a home action. I'm going to keep this super simple. We're going to say render. I guess I'll call it home.html. I actually don't have to. I could call it purplehippo.html, but it just sort of makes sense to call it that. Now I have to create that home.html file, again known as the view. Again, it has to be in the right place. So I'm going again to the pages folder that lives in the views folder, that lives in the app folder, and I'm making a new file. So I'm right-clicking, hitting new file, typing home.html, hitting enter. I double-click on that, put some HTML that says this is my home page, save it. Sorry, I haven't been mentioning that I'm saving this as I'm going. I'm doing Command-S or Control-S to save it as I go. And now if I go back to my website and I get rid of that About Me part, I'm just going to the home page. Now I actually have the home page.
You have to restart.
I didn't have to restart to do that. There's some things when you're programming in Rails that you have to restart your server, but
Is
just
there like a debugging mode for Rails?
sorry, there's different debugging tools. Is that what you're asking?
No, like debugging means that you can make changes in the app without having to restart it.
Yeah, that's what's going on here. Meaning I didn't have to restart the server. Okay, we're running out of time. So let me just show you one last cool thing. Everything we've done so far, all the web pages, we have all of two web pages on our website so far, right? They're all very static. They never change. It always says the same thing every time, or until a developer changes the code. But let's say I wanted to do something dynamic, where things change, right? The difference between like a website and a web application is a website is static, right? Let's say the online brochure to my dentist. It never changes. It's the same pages, the same picture of the smiling dentist and a map, and it's always the same, never changes. But Facebook, for example, on the other hand, it changes all the time. Amazon changes all the time. So let's make our website change all the time by doing something dynamic. And to do that, I'm going to go back to Cloud9 and do something really spiffy on my homepage. I'm going to say the current time is, now if I said 7:23 p.m., obviously that works now, but it's all good now. But in a minute from now, that's going to be wrong. It's going to be right once a day. Right now it's really 7:24, but if I refresh my page, it still says 7:23 because it's static. I hard coded in. What if I want it to be the actual time? So the problem with HTML is that HTML is a purely static language. You cannot write dynamic code in HTML. You have a question?
Oh, no, I was actually almost going to chime in there, but I figured.
Yeah. So this is another really cool thing about Ruby on Rails, is that we could put dynamic code in our HTML that will convert to HTML. Let me just, okay, so to do this, currently, as you see, our file name is called home.html. We're going to go ahead and make a slight change to that and add, so I'm going to right click and click on rename. I'm going to rename this file. And at the end, I'm going to keep .html, but after that I'm going to add .erb. So my file name is home.html.erb. ERB, it's pretty rare. You probably never, many of you may have never seen before a file that has 2 dots in it. But you could have that. And ERB stands for Embedded Ruby. It allows us to embed the Ruby language within our HTML. Let me show you how. So instead of having this 7:23 p.m. right here, I'm going to embed some Ruby within my HTML. To do so, you have to use this awful syntax, frankly, that looks like this. So that's less than sign, percent equals, followed by a percent greater than sign. And with that is basically saying anything I put in there is not HTML, it's Ruby. And I'm going to put within there, if you remember when we were playing around with Ruby in the terminal, I'm going to put time.now. And let's see what happens. If I refresh my page, yikes. Well, that's the current time. Look how it's 26:09, but if I refresh the page, now it's 26:18. It's dynamic, it changes. Now we can improve this by making it more readable, but the concept that it is the current time, at least in some time zone, it's a dynamic concept. Now, don't be fooled. By the time your browser receives this HTML, it's pure HTML. The browser doesn't understand Ruby. Browsers only understand HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. In fact, if we right-click and view source, view page source, that shows you the HTML behind any web page. If you look at the HTML here, we don't see any of that embedded Ruby stuff. We just see the result. What's going on is that the way it works as embedded Ruby is that Rails, but right before Rails takes this HTML and zips it to your browser, it first takes all the embedded Ruby in it, converts it to HTML, and then sends the HTML to your server. But that allows us to have the concept of dynamic web pages because we are using Ruby, which is a dynamic language, embedded in our HTML. Rails takes it, converts it to regular static HTML, sends it to the server, but in effect, we still have the current time, and it will always be updated every time we update our page. Sorry, refresh our page, I should say. I mean, obviously, this is just the beginning, right? This is, I mean, if you join us for 12 weeks, you'll learn how to make Facebook.com. Questions? Does this make sense? Or is this like totally crazy, weird stuff? Or both? Yeah.
Just to make sure I have the syntax down,
Yeah.
under the controller's concerns, could you show us, like go through maybe the application page to make sure that I've got the syntax down then and the pages?
I'm sorry, which page? Which file do you want?
The application _ pages file, first and foremost, under controllers, concerns, you know, the controller files that we have to run before.
The pages controller?
Yeah.
This one here?
Oh, okay.
Which line do you want to know about? Or you're just checking?
Yeah.
So it's render, and then in quotes, the name of your file. Oh, you'll probably catch something like, hey, I didn't change it to .erb. Good catch. Rails is sort of smart and knows what you mean sometimes.
Can you go to the roots.rb?
Yeah.
tab?
So go to the routes. Let me just see if Cloud9, something really cool about like other text editors is you could show like 3 files at the same time. Let me just see if it has
You
that.
just drag it.
I just drag it?
Yeah.
Where?
You just drag it out and then to the side.
Sweet, thank you. Yikes. Oh, that's helpful. I'll have to remember that for my next demonstration. So yeah, here's the routes. That leads to the controller, that leads to the view. And if it's not working, I'm happy to look at it afterwards.
Where does the CSS and JS go?
Yeah, so again, this is not a class on CSS, but as you notice, our page looks awful. There's no color. It's a very basic font. CSS is the language you use to decide the visuals, to make it pretty. There is a place for that in Rails, and that's found within app, assets, style sheets, and then you'd put in the pages that corresponds to our controller. You'd put CSS in there.
So that applies to every single
Yeah, it applies.
page that is assigned to that controller?
That would be nice. It actually applies to your whole website. I mean, I would think like you. Like, why does it just? You have multiple CSS files just for organization's sake, but any CSS you put in here actually applies to your whole website.
Does it really?
What's that?
Does it really?
It does really, yeah. So just
But then how can you change the CSS for each single HTML file? Because
you'd have to use classes and IDs. Are you familiar with that in CSS?
yeah.
Okay. So just to show you very briefly, so I'll just, sorry, that's not it. We're not doing CSS now, but let's do some. I'm going to say that all H1s should be green. That's basically what this is saying. So now if I go to my website and refresh my page, now it's green. Can you see that it's green? Doesn't it look so much better now? Obviously, you have to put a lot of CSS in to make it look normal. But yes, does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Great.
So ideally, well, not ideally, but realistically, all the CSS goes into one file.
Well, the idea for every
Is that part of the convention?
well, for every controller you make, it does make separate CSS files.
Okay.
So the convention is to put the appropriate code in the appropriate files. However, it will apply everywhere. It is sort of weird, but that's the convention. Yeah.
When you were talking about choosing a web browser, is there a particular reason why you like Chrome?
Good question. I happen to like Chrome. They're all pretty good. Internet Explorer on Microsoft historically has been a disaster. It might be better now. I like Chrome. When we teach the class, we use Chrome just so everyone's on the same page. But Firefox is good too. Is there another one? I mean, Safari, for testing purposes, doesn't really matter. But there's other things you could do with Chrome. Like, if I right-click and hit inspect, I could like dig around and play with the HTML and do stuff. And the tools that come with Chrome are really good and better than in Safari. But if you're just using a browser, just the normal way, just to look at a web page, it doesn't really matter which one you use. Yeah.
Is it possible to pull up the installed version of Ruby since this is just to see like how it looks? Or do you have
Yeah. So when I'm working, I mean, what does my environment look like? So when I'm coding, I use, here's my terminal. It's just an app in a separate window. I'll pull up my text editor. So I use Sublime Text. This is some code of a website. This is a website when students join us and they enroll. We have like an enrollment agreement they fill out online. That's what this is. But you could see here, see app, controllers, views. It's the same code base. It's just in this text editor.
Are you using Bootstrap?
Bootstrap?
Yeah.
I am using Bootstrap. Yeah. You could tell from the different classes, right? The row and stuff. So, I mean, some people use like dual or triple monitors. You might keep like a terminal in one monitor, text editor in another monitor, browser in a third monitor. I'm just sort of, I don't know, low maintenance. So I just will switch back. I'll run my server here, generate new controllers here, do other stuff in the terminal, and I'll go back and forth between the text editor and the browser and just flip back and forth like that. I'll tab and just test it out, refresh, stuff like that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I just wanted to see how
Yeah.
it looked.
Yeah. But to do so, through my terminal, you have to enter a bunch of commands and gobbledygook to install Ruby on Rails to be on your computer in the first place.
Okay.
But once it's there, I could do, I'll just enlarge this a little bit, I could do the same IRB and 1+1 and et cetera. I mean, there is something nice in Cloud 9 where it's all on the same screen. There is something nice to that. This is sort of what it's called like an IDE, integrated development environment. It keeps all the different tools in one screen. It's just a matter of preference. Any other questions?
You mentioned that Cloud9 is kind of like in problems right now or something?
Is what?
That Cloud9 is like in problems, like financial problems or something?
No, I didn't say that. Sorry. I'm
You
like
said
being on record.
Nitro.
Nitrous closed down.
Okay.
And I'm just
Cloud9
making a
is
pre-
because
I'm
you
just
really
making
like
a
Cloud9.
Yeah, I'm just making a prediction that Cloud9 will follow the same route because I just don't see developers deciding to use this professionally. It's amazing for a meetup where I could present like this, you could follow along, and you don't have to download anything. So I hope it doesn't go away. But
I really like it because I can just use it in any computer really.
yeah, absolutely. It has potential.
I
Just
wouldn't
not
do
for the
Java or
regular.
C++ there, but like Python, Ruby, and other script languages. That
Yeah, but if you worked with it every day, you wouldn't want to work with this. You'd want to work with your own local software. Or not. I guess there's someone who uses it. Other than for demonstrations. Any other questions? Does this make sense? Is this somewhat clear? Okay. I mean, if there's any one takeaway I'd love for you to take away from this, is not anything about Ruby or Rails or HTML or web requests. It's the fact that everything about coding is understandable. You just take step after step and build up from there. Obviously, I'm trained how to explain things. I'm an educator, so it has to be explained well. But everything could be explained. Nothing is like rocket science. And I bet you rocket science could also be explained if someone taught it well.
Can you show how to link the about page from the home page?
I could show you that after if you want.
Okay.
Yeah, I just don't want to keep everyone here because I think. Any questions about anything code related? Learning to code? Where to go from here?
What's the cannot render? So this ended up in my terminal.
I'll look at it in a second. Yeah.
I do have one question.
Yeah.
With someone with no programming experience, I'm like, I have touched like HTML and CSS, but like with someone that doesn't have that, like, I know all these languages, like, have like, not really a path you can learn anything, right? But if someone's learning Ruby and Ruby's Rails is like marketable in a job that way, or it's more recommended as learning HTML and CSS, like, can you do well without it in terms of
Can you do all without what?
like learning HTML and CSS?
And what do you know?
Just minimal of it, but of HTML and CSS.
For to be a web developer?
Yes, correct. To be a Ruby developer.
Oh, to a Ruby developer? It depends what you're doing. If you're doing so, if I understand your question correctly, like how much do you need to actually know to be a web developer from among these languages?
Yeah, because I know in the marketplace that there's like software development jobs and that can be a mixture of things, but then there's like specific like Ruby developers and that's what they're looking for.
Yeah, so within the industry, within the field, there's different types of positions. Some people could focus just on the server code, like the Ruby code, like the controller stuff, in which case they don't have to necessarily be experts in HTML and CSS. Some people are more like what's called front end, where they're writing the HTML and CSS and also JavaScript. The truth is, like HTML and CSS, anyone can learn it in like a day.
Yeah, it's pretty easy.
Now, to be really good at it, you have to practice it. I'm not really good at it. Anytime in a job where I had to do HTML, CSS, I didn't do it every day. Every time I had to do it, I had to just like dust off my skills and relearn it, which I was always able to do. But there are people who do HTML, CSS all day, every day, and they're like amazing experts at it. But for the typical what's called full stack developer, those are people who do both front and back end. They usually go back and forth, and they're maybe stronger in one. They might be stronger in back, but proficient enough in the other, or strong in front, or they might be stronger in front but proficient enough in the back. This depends on your job, what you're doing. If you're doing like 50-50 each day, then you become really strong in both. But you don't have to necessarily be an expert in both. You could be an expert in one and just good enough in the other. It just depends on the job you're working for. Other questions? Yeah.
What's a good in-between step in between like intro meetup and 12 weeks?
Good question. So we do give a bunch of meetups. Every Wednesday I give a meetup. So I'm trying to change up the topic. So that's one thing. Perhaps going up to other introductory meetups. Now there's various online tutorials. So I haven't used all of them, or any of them, but I know of them. There's things like Code Academy, Treehouse, Code School. They've all heard great things about them. And a lot of them will have different courses. Some even have Ruby on Rails intro. So that might be a way to take your skills further. Generally, those don't make you job ready, but those are what I recommend those for. Is like, it's a good way to know if this is something you'd want to do for your job. So you might toy around with that for a while. We do often have students who have been trying to teach themselves to code online for a while, maybe even a year, and they're like, you know what, I just want to just really make sure I'm marketable and that I know my stuff, and I'm sort of going slow on my own. I want to just join a boot camp. But a lot of people who join Actualize are people who have been doing like Code Academy for a year, and they're just like, I'm going very slow. I want to just jumpstart it and get in. But we usually, only accept people once they know for sure this is what they want to do. Someone who never saw code and says they want to come, we're like, okay. You first have to just know this is something you want to do. Do you even know what's involved? Do you realize that if you're missing a single comma, nothing will work? I could go right here, let me go to my routes file, right? And I'll just do a capital G, right, for my get file. I'm pretty sure, nothing works. I broke my whole website. And it is sort of a scary thing. If you're a web developer working for Facebook and you go into their code and change a lowercase something to a capital something, the whole website could not work. I mean, obviously they have things in place to prevent that from happening, but there's a certain attention to detail that one needs. So we want to make, something you have to know this is something you want to do. I love it though. it utilizes a lot of creativity. Obviously this is simple stuff, but for more complex things, you have to think of innovative solutions. And again, it all boils down, how do I tell my piece of metal that doesn't know anything? How do I get it to do what I want? Yeah, you had a question?
Ruby's used for that in automated test cases also.
Is Ruby used for automated test cases? Sure, it could be. There's frameworks for that,
Okay.
for automated testing, but so are other languages too.
No.
Ruby is mostly used in context of web because it's sort of tie into Rails. You could use Ruby on its own for other things. I could write a Ruby app so that we have a lead instructor here who made a Ruby app that if he types a certain thing in his terminal, he gets pizza delivered to his house. Just making his life a little bit easier. So there's no web there. It's just, or there's no website, web page. So Ruby is a general purpose language, but it's most classically found in the context of Rails or building websites.
You were talking before about Python,
Yeah.
aside from speed, what are the reasons that people use?
Yeah, Python and Ruby are actually very, very similar in their advantages, disadvantages. I consider them like sister languages. A lot of our grads get jobs in Python just as they do Ruby. They're very similar.
The main difference is the way that it's used. Ruby is mostly web dev. Python can also do web dev, but it also is used for many other different things.
So there's a lot of Python is more, whereas Ruby is generally mostly only found in web. Python is also could be web, but as he's saying, is also found in many other examples as well. In science and math, it's actually used a lot. You could do the same things in Ruby. You could use the same things in Ruby, but that's just how, things evolved. People use Python for a lot of computer science courses in university use Python now. Yeah, well, thank you all for coming. I'm not going anywhere, so if you want to stick around and ask more questions, I'm here. Thank you all for coming.